war was the culmination of more or less 70 years of conflict between the Arabs living in Palestine and the Jews who immigrated to Palestine from 1882 onwards. It's probably the most important of Israel's wars. It's the most important in the sense that it is the one which changed the geopolitical realities of the Middle East. The war broke out the day after the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution proposing the partition or division of Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jews said yes. There were fringe groups in the Jewish community which didn't accept it, but the Zionist mainstream and its leadership said yes. The Arabs of Palestine, their leadership, and the leaders of the surrounding Arab states all said no. And on 30 November, the day after the resolution, the shooting began. Arabs began shooting at Jewish targets, and gradually the war snowballed into a full-scale war. It was an unusual war, the 1948 war by international law, historical standards, unusual in a number of ways. Firstly, it was composed of two distinct, different halves, more or less dividing equally, 6 months for each. The first half of the war, from November 1947 until May 1948, was a civil war between the Palestinian communities, the Jewish and Arab communities of Palestine. Simply a civil war with militias shooting at each other, villagers shooting at each other, until it ended with Jewish victory on the 14th of May 1948, when the State of Israel was declared. And the next day, the 15th of May, the second half of the war began, a war between the states, between the newly declared State of Israel and the neighboring Arab countries who invaded Palestine, and some of them attacking Israel on the 15th of May. And for the following 6 months or 7 months, there was a war between the states, which Israel also won, assuring its presence, its continued presence in the Middle East. It was also an unusual war, certainly the Civil War half of the war, insofar as it was a war fought between two communities while a third country was actually ruling the land. The British had a mandate over Palestine since the beginning of the 1920s, more or less since they conquered the country in 1917-18 from the Ottoman Empire, and they ruled officially until the 14th of May 1948, and had troops, had an administration in place until the 14th of May. In other words, they were there when the Jews and Arabs were busy fighting, and there are all sorts of views of how the British functioned during those 6 months in which the communities were at loggerheads, but they were there and affected the way the war was fought by both sides. My study during part of the millennium of the war underlined the importance, in my view, of the religious element in the war. In other words, the war wasn't just a political territorial war, though it was that as well, but it was also a religious war from the Palestinian side, or from the Arab side in general, a jihad, a holy war against an infidel presence or infidel takeover of land which they regarded as Muslim and sacred. Over the decades of conflict, the amount of religion involved in the war in Palestine and outside varied. On the Jewish side, 1948 wasn't a holy war, it wasn't a jihad, it wasn't a religious war. For the very simple reason that the Jewish population of Palestine at the time, incidentally numbering about 630,000, maybe more than 90% non-religious. The whole of the Zionist movement from 1882 was essentially a secular movement, a movement which overthrew God. Before that, Jews had believed in God in the diaspora in Eastern Europe, etc. The Zionist movement, in addition to being a national rebellion to achieve national rights for the Jews in Palestine, was also a rebellion against God or the religious establishment, the whole idea of religion dictating the lives of people. And so when the leadership of the Zionists moved towards the war in the 30s and 40s, they weren't thinking in terms of religion. They knew that Jerusalem had been the holy city of Judaism over the centuries. They knew that it was the capital of a Jewish state in centuries past, but they weren't thinking in terms of religious conquest or religious achievement. The idea of a third temple, which now we sometimes hear from Jews here and there, would have been regarded as ridiculous, was regarded as ridiculous, never even arose, even among the small segment of the Jewish population in Palestine, they wouldn't have even raised the subject because it sounded so ludicrous in 1947-48. In the bureaucracy and machinery of Zionism, of the new state, in 48, the religious element had a very, very insignificant part. They didn't have any real presence in the army, the security services, or any of the important ministries in the country. So religion wasn't important. Now, unfortunately, in my view, religion has become an element in the conflict from the Zionist side as well, because the religious element within Zionism has grown disproportionately over the decades due to large scale, much higher birth rates, and so Israeli governments today have large religious coalition partners and have a lot of weight, and the secular movement in the territories is, of course, in great measure a movement of religious settlers. It's not accepted conventional wisdom among historians of the conflict, but I'm telling you that 48 was also a jihadi religious war. But this is my view, this is what I think the evidence tells us. More study needs to be done on the subject. I think scratched the surface in this sense. On the 2nd of December 1947, 3 or 4 days after the UN passed its partition resolution, the ulama of Al-Azhar University, the leading university in the Arab world, the oldest university in the Arab world, the leading university of the Arab world, its council of theologians, what are called the ulama in Arabic, passed a fatwa, a religious ruling, and Al-Azhar's sheikh and ulama are the most important religious deciders or rulers in the Sunni Arab world. There is no pope in the Muslim world. It divides into Sunnis and Shiites, and among the Sunnis also there's no one religious figure who's important. But if there is one religious body which is the most important in Sunni Islam, that's the ulama of Al-Azhar University, headed by the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the rector of the university. On the 2nd of December, they passed a fatwa calling on the world's Muslims to go out on jihad to destroy the incipient Jewish state. They called on all Muslims, all fit Muslims. Those unfit were supposed to contribute other things, but fit Muslims were, according to their interpretation of the Quran, were bound to join, mobilize and join the crusade against the Jews in Palestine. This fatwa was reiterated by the ulama of Al-Azhar in April 1948, a few days before the Egyptian army and other Arab armies marched into Palestine. It was done in advance of that, and if you like, to give it religious imprimatur. And was reiterated again, strangely enough, in December 1948, the fatwa by Al-Azhar, meaning that the Egyptian, the Sunni clergy, or the most important element in the Sunni clergy, was basically saying, we know we've lost the war. By December it was clear the Arabs had lost the war, but we're reissuing the fatwa because this has to stand for future years and future generations, for the second and third and whatever bout there will be against the Jews. It is still imperative on the Muslims to destroy the Jewish state. In January 1948, a month later, a woman called Matiel Muranam gave an interview. Now, the woman was a Lebanese Christian woman who had married a Palestinian and served as the chairwoman of a very small organization, which was in fact the women's organization attached to the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was the ruling body of the Palestinian Arab National Movement after 1936, and was the group headed by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the exiled Mufti of Jerusalem, which had led the Palestinians to reject the 47 UN resolution and had led them to war. This woman headed the women's organization of the Arab Higher Committee, and she gave an interview. This Lebanese Christian woman who had moved to Palestine a few years before. The UN decision, she said in this interview, has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared, all the Jews will eventually be massacred. This is the Christian woman of Lebanon. Apparently she also was impressed by the fatwa for jihad, the atmosphere surrounding the war of jihad. In August 1948, this is 6 months on, the Palestinians by then had lost their civil war, had been crushed, many of them going into exile. One of the exiled members of the Arab Higher Committee, which I mentioned before, the ruling body of the Palestinian National Movement, Emil Ururi, said in an interview, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph in London, we must inculcate in the heart of every Arab hatred for the Jews, and we must renew the jihad against Israel. And this is a Christian, again, not a Muslim. Following the 15 May 1948 invasion by the Arab armies of Palestine, the Saudi regime ruled from Riyadh, organized what were called jihadi festivals. Some 2,000 people registered as volunteers to fight in the war, and it was reported that at the time by British diplomats who were told this by Saudis, apparently, Saudi officials, that 200,000 are ready to perform jihad and sacrifice their lives. Thankfully, the 200,000 didn't actually mobilize or arrive anywhere, but the whole point of what I'm saying is the word had gotten around and was accepted that jihad, this was jihad. Distances were long, people couldn't travel then as they do today to Turkey and then cross over a border and go on jihad. It wasn't very simple then, and there were a British presence prevented that also. A British presence in Egypt prevented the volunteers from reaching the battlefront from the Maghreb, from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis, but there was some foreign participation, some of it even from Bosnia, based on jihad. The second thing which came up as I was writing the book was the war aims of the different sides in the conflict. Traditionally, the Jews at the time and since then have described the Arab war aim as throwing the Jews into the sea. That was the phrase. Looking at the documentation, it's far more complex than that. The war aims on the Jewish side were actually quite simple. In both parts of the war, in the Civil War and in the war between the states. The Jews wanted to survive. The Jewish community in Palestine fought for its survival, and then the state of Israel and its community fought for survival against the Arab invading armies. That was the essential main war aim, to survive, to weather the onslaught. To that initial war aim accrued a second war aim, more or less in March, April 1948, which was to expand the borders of the Jewish state beyond the territory allocated by the UN for Jewish statehood. The UN had allocated something like 6,000 square miles of Palestine's 10,000 square miles in its 1947 resolution for a Jewish state. In March, April, after 4 months of assault by Palestine's Arabs, and with the prospect of the pan-Arab invasion being imminent, the Arabs kept saying, we're going to invade as soon as the British leave. Zionist leadership, military and political, said, well, if what was decided by the UN has been thrown in the trash can by Arab aggression, we're not going to abide by the borders the UN allocated as well. And from that point on, added certain territories to the state. And Israel emerged from the war, incidentally, with 8,000 square miles of Palestine's 10,000 square miles. In other words, it had gained 2,000 extra square miles in the course of the fighting. So that's the second war aim. The third war aim, which also was added to the Jewish war aim, never became official, never was enunciated as policy, but I believe can be seen as a war aim, though there are arguments among historians about this to this day. And that was to reduce the number of Arabs in the Jewish state as it emerged. If you like, to expel Arabs, to have as few Arabs, as small an Arab minority as possible in the emergent Jewish state. And the army and the civil bureaucracies took measures, occasionally even expelling Arab populations from villages and towns, to achieve this goal. expelling the Arabs was never adopted as policy. It was never adopted as policy by any of the major political parties, Mapai and so on in the coalition. It was never adopted as policy by the cabinet of the Jewish state. It was never adopted as policy by the general staff of the army. But there was an atmosphere of transfer, and some units kicked out Arabs, and all units, and the government decided in June 1948, or the units following the government's decision in June, which was periodically reiterated, not to allow refugees to return. In other words, if people had fled their homes, their towns, their villages, and so on, the government had decided not on their expulsion, but not to allow them to return, which can be, if you like, seen as an expulsive decision, but that's the expulsive element in official policy. On the Arab side, you have to look at the Palestinian Arab war aims, and then in the second half of the war, at the Arab states' war aims. And here you have a number of problems. A historian encounters a number of problems, one of which is methodological, if you like, and that is that there is no Palestinian archive. There is no national archive, so there was no Palestinian state. It was a fairly backward society. It didn't produce documentation. We don't know what was decided or said in the councils where things were decided by the Palestinian national leadership, much of which was abroad, living in exile in Egypt, in Lebanon. So we don't really have firm proof of what the Palestinians wanted as they went to war, not to mention that the Palestinians themselves were disorganized. So if Haj Jamil wanted something, the head of the Palestine Arab Higher Committee, it doesn't mean that people who belong to the opposition to Haj Jamil al-Husseini thought the same way, or that the different armed bands who fought in Palestine had any clear idea of what the real national goal was. He didn't really control them properly. That's one of the reasons they lost the war, the Palestinians. So you have a problem of that sort as well. What is clear, incidentally, and this came to me as a surprise going through the documentation which is available, which is Israeli documentation, UN documentation, American documentation, English documentation, and there's a lot of it, was that you don't hear almost ever the phrase "throw the Jews into the sea." In other words, Western diplomats reporting from Amman, Palestine, the British authorities living in Palestine, talking to Arabs, etc., they don't hear this phrase being used. Now, it could be that the Palestinian leadership was being cautious. It may have said it in its inner councils, but they didn't say this to British or American diplomats, and Israeli intelligence didn't monitor radio traffic or other types of communications in which they said this clear sentence: our aim is to destroy the Jewish state or throw them into the sea. It's not that it doesn't appear at all, it appears, but very rarely in Palestinian discourse at the time among the leadership. The same, incidentally, is true about the Arab states. They usually talk, when they go to war, they talk about saving the Palestinians, not throwing the Jews into the sea, but saving the Palestinians from the Jews. Occasionally you'll find the phrase used, throw the Jews into the sea. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Abdul Rahman Azam, used that phrase when he talked to the British representative in Amman just before the Pan-Arab invasion in early May, and he said, and this is what Kirkbride, the British representative, then sent on to London. The man said, "We'll throw the Jews into the sea." That's what Azam said, and you can say the Secretary General of the Arab League represents the Arab consensus or Pan-Arab view. One other thing, there was a fly in the ointment on the Arab side. The Arab coalition, which went to war and sent their armies across the borders on the 15th of May, included Jordan, which had the best of the Arab armies. It was a small army, was called the Arab Legion, the Jordanian army, but it was the best of the Arab armies. And their purpose, the purpose of the Arab Legion, wasn't to destroy the Jewish state or even attack the Jewish state. It didn't attack the Jewish state at any point in the 48 war, in the May 1948 invasion, the Jordanian army. It went into Palestine to take over the West Bank and to annex it for the king, Abdullah. That's what he wanted them to do, not to fight the Jews. He then went into Jerusalem and decided to, if you like, break his agreement with the British. The British had agreed that he take over the West Bank, in what's today more called the West Bank. They hadn't agreed to him going into Jerusalem, and he decided, what the hell, it's going easily. I'll go to East Jerusalem and take over that area where my father is buried, the holy sites of Islam, Abdullah belonged to the Hashemite family, whose function in Islam or in the Arab world was always to look after the holy sites of Islam until they were kicked out of Mecca and Medina by the Ibn Saud family. But they had this thing about holy sites. So he went into Jerusalem, and this ended up causing a lot of combat between the Arab Legion and the Jewish army. But he didn't attack the areas allocated by the United Nations for Jewish statehood at any point. His armies did not cross the border and attack the areas allocated by the United Nations for Jewish statehood. So in other words, you have this pan-Arab invasion. We know that the aim of the Jordanians was to take the West Bank. The Egyptians didn't want the Jordanians to get too much of Palestine, so in part their invasion was geared to taking other areas of Palestine to prevent them falling into Abdullah's hands, not to prevent the Jews from getting them. This wasn't complex. Incidentally, in traditional Israeli historiography, from 48 onwards, Israeli historiography presented a massed attack of Palestinians and then of the Arab states on the Jewish community and then the state of Israel as geared to the destruction of the Jewish community and of the state. And always said, incidentally, that 5 Arab armies had attacked Israel, and in fact only actually 4 crossed the border, and only 3 of them attacked Israel and Israeli territory. The Lebanese, the 5th element in the Arab invasion, actually never crossed the border. They announced on their radio, the Lebanese, that we've crossed the border and attacked Israel, but the troops actually hadn't crossed the border and hadn't moved on orders from the Christian president and the Christian chief of staff of the Lebanese army. A third subject which emerged from looking at the war was that the war created 3 refugee problems. One of the refugee problems, and that is of 70,000 Jews displaced in the country in the course of the war. Kibbutzim along the borders, sending their women and children to Tel Aviv or to other kibbutzim in the interior, in villages and towns which had been overrun by Arabs, not that many of them, but some had been overrun and their populations exiled, some that is sent away. For example, the inhabitants of the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, some 1,500 people, were simply thrown out by the Jordanians. And so we have a sort of a dozen villages in neighborhoods in which this occurred. And 70,000 Jews for much of the war lived uprooted from their homes in other parts of Palestine. You can say 70,000 isn't much of a figure, but 70,000 was 10% or slightly more than 10% of the whole population of Jewish Palestine. So it wasn't insignificant having to take them in, to care for them and so on, for a people at war on all its fronts during the war. So it was a serious refugee problem. It vanished at the end of the war. By the end of the war, the Israelis had reconquered most of the places that had fallen. The kibbutzim had been made safe, and so the women and children returned to the border of kibbutzim. And those who ended up, who had lived in territory which ended up in Arab hands, were simply resettled somewhere else, like the population of the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. So the problem of Jewish refugees in Palestine from the war vanished by 1949. It didn't last. You don't hear about it. But there was a Jewish refugee problem in Palestine during the war. The second refugee problem is, of course, the refugee problem created among the Arabs, in which 700,000 approximately were uprooted. 700,000 Arabs were uprooted from their homes in the area which became the State of Israel, meaning the area allocated by the United Nations for Jewish statehood, plus the areas conquered by the Jews in the course of the war beyond those borders. Altogether some 700,000. There's argument about the number. The Arabs said it was 900,000, the Jews said it was 500,000. The UN generally said it was about 700 and something thousand, and that's probably the right number. But nobody really knows. But anyhow, something like 700,000 Arabs were uprooted. Most of them, incidentally, were uprooted from one part of Palestine to another, not out of the country. 2/3 of the 700,000 ended up living in refugee camps or villages in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Only 1/3 ended up in other countries, in Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan, across the Jordan. 700,000 were thus uprooted, and several hundred thousand of them ended up in the Arab states. Those, incidentally, who reached Lebanon today, there's maybe 400,000 or 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. having multiplied from the original 90,000 or whatever it was in 1948, don't have citizenship in Lebanon. They live without citizenship and generally without a work permit. So not allowed to work or live basically in Lebanon in any normal way. They just live off basically Western contributions, Western donations via UNRWA and so on. Those who reached Syria ended up without Syrian citizenship. The Syrians didn't give them citizenship, but they do have work permits, so they are generally allowed to work. Those who reached the Gaza Strip didn't receive Egyptian citizenship. The Egyptians took over the Gaza Strip in the 48 war, but never gave the Palestinians their citizenship, and they remain basically citizenless to this day, them and their descendants, in the Gaza Strip. To this day. Those in the West Bank and those who reached East Jordan did receive Jordanian citizenship from the Jordanians, and most of them to this day carry Jordanian citizenship, though in Jordan they complain that they are second-class citizens. They're not allowed into the higher reaches of the army or the office corps of the army, the security services and so on, but they do enjoy basic citizenship and basic rights in Jordan. But I wanted to talk about the third refugee problem, which is less known, and that is the refugeedom of something like 700 to 800,000 Jews from Arab countries. The Jewish communities who lived in the Arab countries before 1948 were all essentially exiled from their lands, from their homes, from their businesses in the wake of the 48 war. Some of them left already at the end of the 48 war. Some of them left even a decade and a half later. The Moroccan Jewish community, the largest of the Arab Jewish communities, 300,000, left only in the 60s after the French had left and after a benign sultan had died. But they were all essentially victims of the war. The intimidation into flight of the Jews of the Arab lands begins with a series of pogroms at the end of 1947, within days or hours, if you like, after the UN passes its partition resolution on the 29th of November. The beginning of December, there's a big pogrom in Aden of Yemeni Jews who are killed. 70 Yemeni Jews who have moved there, they live in camps outside Aden, are murdered, and there were also a series of pogroms in Khalid, Aleppo, Bahrain, and a few other places, which intimidated the Jews into flight. The first community, in fact, which left en masse is the Yemeni Jewish community. In 1949, essentially, they were flown out. They all sort of trekked from Yemen to Aden. Aden at the time wasn't part of Yemen. They trekked southwards to Aden and then were flown out basically by the Israelis, almost all of them arriving in Israel. Iraqi Jews and Egyptian Jews, the two most prosperous Jewish communities in the Arab world. In Iraq there were about 130,000. In Egypt maybe the number was 60,000. Were essentially persecuted in the course of the 48 war. Their leaderships, hundreds or even thousands of the businessmen, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers were put in concentration camps, both in Egypt and in Iraq in 48 and in 49 in two waves. And essentially the Iraqi Jews were pushed out of the country. In 1950 they were all flown out essentially by Israel. The wealthier ones ended up in England, maybe America. The poorer ones, meaning the vast bulk of the Iraqi Jewish community, ended up in Israel. The same pattern, incidentally, adhered in North Africa. The poorer Jews, meaning the 90 or 85% who were poor, many of them in fact illiterate in Morocco, were moved to Israel in the 1960s, and the richer ones ended up in France. The wealthier and better educated ones ended up in France. So it wasn't only a process of being driven out, of pushed by the Arab societies and the Arab states in which they live. As I said, there were pogroms, there were mass incarcerations, there was a lot of social pressure, but it was also to do with the poor. Now the Arab Jewish communities, the Jewish communities in the Arab lands, had never been Zionist. They may have been religious and had this religious impulse of looking to, the land of Israel as holy and perhaps something which maybe the Messiah would bring them back to at some point, but they weren't Zionists. They didn't become Zionists in the national sense, except for very, very small minorities. So they didn't have this impulse to come to Palestine. And on the other side, the Zionist leadership in the 20s, 30s, 40s didn't look to the Arabs the Jews of the Arab lands to come to Palestine. They knew they were not Zionists, and they didn't really need them before the Holocaust, because they had a ready-made pool of potential immigrants who would build the Zionist state in Eastern and Central Europe. But when the Holocaust occurred after 45, the Zionist leadership began to look to the East, to the Arab lands, to the Muslim lands, for potential immigrants, and so stretched out their hands, sent emissaries to try and persuade Jews to start coming. And so when the push began in the Arab states in 1948-49, there was also a certain amount of pull from the Jewish side, from the Zionist side, to bring these people to Palestine, to Israel, what was now Israel. And so you ended up with a majority of Israelis by the 1980s who were actually of Oriental or Arab extraction from Arab states. That changed a bit in the 1990s because 1 million Russian Jews came to Israel, and that changed the balance again to an Ashkenazi majority in the 1990s. But most of the immigrants in the 50s and 60s were, of course, from the Arab lands. I'll devote another 3 minutes to one other subject which arose in writing the book on 48. And it's also a controversial subject, and people are also sensitive about it for various reasons. And that is to do with the balance of forces between the various sides in the 48 war. That is, between the Jewish community and the Arab community in Palestine during the Civil War, and between the State of Israel and the Arab states in the second half, the war between the states, the balance of forces between the sides. Now, what happened in Palestine, Israel, in 48 was a victory of the stronger side. There's a moral question, firstly. The Israelis have always liked to portray themselves, in 48 and later, as the David fighting a massive Goliath. And when you look at the map, of course, there is a massive Goliath. The Arab world stretches from here till kingdom come, and they have hundreds of millions of people today, and then they had tens of millions of people, but they vastly outnumbered the Jews and potentially vastly overpowered the Jews economically in Palestine. There were 630,000 who lived in Palestine. So potentially the Arab states were, of course, much, much stronger than the Jewish community in Palestine, or the measly Jewish community in Palestine. But what actually happened in the course of the war was the Jews organized themselves better. They were far better educated, knew how to organize things better. They were far more unified. They had much stronger motivation than the Palestinian Arabs, and certainly the Arab armies invading from outside. You know, an Egyptian comes to fight in Palestine, okay, Islam and so on, but still he's not fighting for his family or his home. The Jews in Palestine are fighting for their homes. The Iraqi troopers who come from Iraq to Palestine, they barely know where Palestine is. So they're not fighting for their homes. This is the point. The motivation is much smaller. The Jews are fighting for their homes and for their lives and for the lives of their loved ones who are just behind the front line, given that the state is very, very small. In addition, the war occurs 2-3 years after the Holocaust, and the Jews are persuaded and convinced that the Arabs want to throw them into the sea to kill them all. So this raises motivation. We have to defend ourselves and do it well, otherwise we're all going to be slaughtered. That was how it was seen, and it may have actually ended that way had the Jews lost the war. Even if the Arab policy wasn't to slaughter all the Jews in Palestine should they win the war, this could have been the side effect of victory. Arab armies conquering Tel Aviv. Who knows how the Arab troops conquering Tel Aviv would have behaved? We see Arabs behaving in the Middle East in various very unpleasant ways now, and they've done this for a long, long time. It's not something new. So the Jews had a good reason to think that something really terrible was going to happen should they lose the war. So this adds a lot of motivation. The Jews were much stronger than the Arabs economically. This doesn't look right, but that's how it was. The Jews were supported by American Jewry economically. They received somewhere between $100 and $150 million in the course of the year to fight the war, to wage the war. And that money was an enormous amount of money. That's billions and billions of dollars in today's terms, and enabled the Jews to tide themselves over the war, to purchase arms, and to bring them in and to deploy them. In addition, there was a large qualitative manpower edge on the Jewish side. That is, the Jews were much better soldiers than the Arabs by and large, save, if you like, for the Arab Legion, which was probably the best of the armies fighting in the war, though, as I said, it was very small. The Jews, many of them had had some form of military experience in the British Army in World War II or other areas. They had several thousand volunteers coming from abroad, pilots, naval personnel, even tank commanders. The commander of one of the major tank brigades was a Canadian, for example, the 7th Brigade, Ben Dunkelman. So they had a lot of expertise in warfare, or a certain amount of expertise, whereas the Arab armies, save for the Jordanians, had no military experience at all. And they weren't really armies built for war. Only after 45 did the French and the British begin to try and build up these armies into proper armies. Before that, they were essentially palace guards, who paraded up and down or something outside the king's palace. So they weren't very efficient. This isn't exactly to dismiss the danger. On the 12th of May 1948, 2 days before Israel declared independence, and 3 days before the Arab armies marched in from across the borders, Ben Gurion summoned his defense chiefs for a consultation and asked them, the prospect was there was going to be a pan-Arab invasion, and he asked them, General Yigael Yadin, who was the head of operations of the Haganah, in effect the commander-in-chief of the Haganah. The commander was sick most of the war, and Israel Galili, his number 2. He asked them, what do you think are the chances of survival or victory should the Arab states invade, as they said they would and as they did? And Yigael Yadin says to him, 50-50. That's the chances. He uses 2 phrases. He says 50-50 in English, and he says "Hachansim shavim," which means the chances are equal. Now this, of course, was based on the premise that the Arab armies would function fairly efficiently, which they didn't. But nonetheless, they did manage to fight, and they gave Israel a very hard time. 6,000 Jews died in the War of Independence. That's 1% of the Jewish population was killed. Say America had lost 1% of its population in the Vietnam War. They actually lost America 58,000 people dead in the Vietnam War over 10 years. Israel lost 6,000, 1% of the population. Had America lost 1% of its population in the Vietnam War, you would have had 1.5 million dead. That's what we're talking about. That's the equivalent. So it wasn't an easy struggle, even though it sounds in retrospect that the Jews should have won because they had a lot of elements going for them.